The wind carried a restless whisper across the wide desert, the kind that warned riders and wanderers that something important had shifted in the land. Dawn had barely broken, yet the sky already glowed with that old American gold, glowing over the mesas and deep canyons, like a lantern guiding the brave. In that early light, the Apache warrior named Kachada stood on the ridge, his breath steady, his eyes sharp, his spirit fixed on one purpose. For 3 nights he had searched without pause, refusing rest, refusing shade, refusing anything that would slow the hunt for the child who had vanished near the canyon river. The people trusted him because he had never once failed them, and the land itself seemed to move aside when he traveled through it. His footsteps were silent, his strength constant, and his heart fully anchored in duty. He knew the desert as if it were part of his own blood. He could read the smallest sign, the faintest track, the shifted stone, the bent blade of grass. And though the winds sometimes wiped away the marks he needed, he did not waver. He believed that a warrior who carried truth in his heart would always find his way, no matter how wide or wild the frontier. But this time, something heavier pressed against his chest each time he scanned the plains. It was not fear, it was something else. Something pulling at the back of his mind as if trying to warn him that this search was leading him toward more than the missing child, toward something unexpected, something he was not prepared for. The child's trail had led him far beyond the grazing lands, past the scattered cliffs and into a lonely stretch where travelers rarely passed. The old ranchers whispered that ghosts circled these parts, but Kachada did not believe in such tales. He believed in the living, the breathing, and the choices that shaped them. Even so, a strange stillness hung in the air as he made his way deeper into the canyon valley. The familiar sounds of desert life were faint. No hawk called, no lizard skittered. It was as if the whole land held its breath. Kachada paused beside a fallen tree and knelt to the ground. He brushed the sand with his fingers, feeling the warmth lingering from yesterday's sun. There, half covered, was a small print, the kind made by a child not long ago. His pulse steadied with renewed purpose, yet a second print beside it made him freeze. This one was larger, shaped by a woman's foot, not one from his people. The pattern was different, the spacing uncertain, as if the woman who left it had been stumbling, or afraid, or running. That made his jaw tighten. It meant someone else had stepped into this mystery. And if danger had touched the lost child, it might have touched her too. He rose and followed the trail as the valley narrowed. The air grew cooler, and the shade thickened under the tall rock walls. He could hear water, trickling somewhere ahead, echoing off stone in a slow, steady rhythm. The place felt hidden, tucked away from the world. His grip tightened on the leather strap across his chest as he prepared for whatever waited there. The old stories told by travelers said that strangers sometimes wandered into this land, drawn by desperation or chased by hardship. Some survived, some vanished. Kachada prayed this unknown woman had not become another story whispered around night fires. The brush grew dense as he approached the river bend. His instincts sharpened. Something was nearby. He moved with the quiet strength of a mountain cat, each step controlled, each breath steady. He expected a wounded child, expected tracks showing a struggle. He expected something familiar to a warrior's eye. What he did not expect was the sound of a soft voice carried by the water, a voice strained with fright, yet gentle, a voice not belonging to a child. Kachada stopped behind a wide boulder. He pressed his hand to the stone, leaned slightly forward, and looked. And there she was. A young woman knelt at the river's edge, her clothes torn from travel, her hair tangled from wind and fear. Her hands cupped water as if she had not drunk for days, but her eyes darted around like a hunted deer, searching for safety yet expecting danger. She looked far from home, far from any protection, carrying worry in every trembling breath. For a moment Kachada wondered if she had been roaming the night searching for the same child he sought, or if trouble had driven her here long before he arrived. Her presence struck him like a hard blow to the chest, not because she was fragile, not because she was lost, but because something in her eyes held a silent strength, a quiet fire that he recognized deep within himself. Who had fought the world for too long yet refused to surrender. Something in that fierce, vulnerable expression pulled him forward before he even realized his feet were moving. He stepped out from behind the boulder, slow and steady, letting the sound of his boots on stone announce him. The woman whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat, her eyes widened with terror as she saw the tall Apache warrior standing in the shade. His face marked with the paint of his people, the early sun flashing across the carved blade strapped to his chest. He lifted a hand, not threatening, but calm, urging her to breathe. She did not run. She did not scream. She simply stared, as if she could not decide whether he was her salvation or another danger sent by fate. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words tangled before leaving her mouth. Chada's heart beat slower, heavier. The land around them fell into complete silence. Even the river seemed to hush. He approached, with cautious respect, aware that any sudden move could shatter the fragile moment. His voice was strong yet gentle when he spoke, shaped by years of old American grit and the calm of a man who had seen both peace and war. He asked if she had seen a lost child. She swallowed, trying to steady herself, but before she could answer, her gaze shifted past him. Her fear returned, sharper than before, as if something else lurked behind the ridge he had just crossed. Kachada felt the shift in the air. He sensed movement somewhere beyond the rocks. The woman's trembling hand pointed toward the canyon shadows as her breath rushed out in warning.
Oh.
The warrior turned, his muscles tensing, his instincts rising like a storm. Something had followed her, something that had been waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. The trail of the lost child had led him here. But now he understood that the child was not the only one in danger. The young woman carried her own secret, her own threat pressing close behind her, and whatever waited in those shadows was drawing near fast. As Kachada stepped forward, ready to shield her from what approached, she reached out and grabbed his arm with surprising force. Her touch made him freeze. Her voice shook when she finally spoke, telling him something that turned his breath cold and changed everything he thought he knew about the search. But before she could finish her warning, the sound behind them grew louder, and the danger that had been stalking her finally stepped into the light. The moment the shadow moved, Kachada shifted his stance, placing himself between the young woman and the threat edging closer through the canyon. The air tightened, carrying the scent of dust, cold stone, and something else he could not yet name. His hand hovered near the carved blade strapped across his chest, not drawn, but ready. The woman's grip on his arm trembled with fear she could no longer hide. Her eyes fixed on the dark gap between the rocks, as if she had seen that shape before, as if whatever followed her had been haunting her long before he arrived. He felt her fear like a spark against his skin, and he knew this was no ordinary traveler. She carried a danger tied tightly around her, one that had already crossed paths with the missing child. A soft crunch of gravel echoed, then another, slow and deliberate. For a heartbeat, the canyon felt too small, too silent, as if the land itself leaned in to listen. When the figure finally stepped from the shadows, the woman gasped and stumbled back, clutching her skirt as if bracing herself against the memory tied to his presence. Kachada saw the man's stance, the way he held himself upright but tense. His shoulders marked with dust, his breath uneven. He was not Apache and not from any nearby settlement. He carried the look of someone who had wandered far, someone driven by desperation rather than strength. His clothes were torn at the sleeves, his boots half worn through, and dried blood stained the side of his coat. The man's eyes flicked to Kachada with sharp distrust before settling on the young woman with something colder beneath. The warrior recognized it instantly. Fear mixed with guilt. A man carrying secrets. A man who had seen something he was not eager to share. But before Kachada could speak, the stranger's voice cut through the canyon. Low and hoarse, telling the woman she should have stayed where he left her. The way she flinched made Kachada's pulse harden. He stepped forward, grounding his voice with calm weight. He asked the man if he had seen the lost child. The stranger hesitated, his jaw tightening. His eyes shifted to the river, then to the woman, then back to Kachada, as if calculating his answer. Finally, he shook his head but did it too quickly, too carelessly. The lie sat unsteady on his tongue. Kachada could read lies the way he read tracks in the dirt. He knew the man was hiding something, and that whatever it was tied to both the woman and the missing child. Before anything else could be said, the woman whispered a single word so faint it seemed to float on the wind. A name not belonging to either man. A name that made the stranger stiffen and glance sharply at her. Kachada repeated the name aloud, letting it settle between them. The moment he did, the stranger's composure cracked. His eyes darted toward the deeper trail where the canyon narrowed, as if fearing someone else might appear. The tension tightened, and for a moment Kachada wondered if the stranger had been running from this name or toward it. Yet before he could question him, the man suddenly turned and fled down the narrow path, staggering but quick. Kachada lunged forward, ready to follow, but the woman's voice broke behind him, pleading for him to stop. He halted only because something in her tone carried a raw truth, the kind that came from deep pain rather than panic. When he faced her, she shook her head, struggling to form words, her breath caught between warning and desperation. The warrior could see her heart pounding like a frightened bird. Caught between two storms, she told him that chasing the man would lead him straight into danger far worse than he imagined. She tried to explain, but her voice wavered under the weight of what she carried. Kachada waited, giving her room to steady herself. He had learned long ago that patience often revealed more than force. She took a trembling breath and told him she had been searching for someone too. Not a child, but a girl she had sworn to protect. A girl who vanished the same night as the little one Kachada sought. Her path had crossed the stranger's by accident. What she discovered led her into the very shadows the stranger now fled into. She did not know the land, she admitted softly. She only knew she had to keep moving, even when her strength faded and fear clawed at her ribs. Her words held grit and honesty, but something else lingered beneath them, something she did not yet say. Kachada could see it in her eyes. She was holding back a part of the truth, not out of deceit, but out of terror. As she spoke, Kachada noticed the faint bruising on her wrist, the tear along her sleeve, the way her voice faltered whenever she glanced at the narrow trail. He knew she had endured more than a simple chase. She had been running for a reason, and that reason, whatever it was still very close. He asked her to tell him everything she could, starting with who the stranger was. She looked down at the river, watching the water swirl as if it held answers she feared to voice. After a long pause, she murmured that the stranger was not hunting her alone. He was part of a group, a desperate band of men who had taken something valuable, something that did not belong to them, and fled into the wilderness. On their path, they had crossed the lost child, and the girl she was searching for, she was certain of it. Kachada felt the land shift beneath the weight of her words. He asked her if the children were alive. She hesitated again, but nodded slowly. She believed they were, though she did not know how much longer that truth could hold. She had heard one of the men speaking about keeping the children hidden, but she did not know where. She had tried to follow them, but fear and exhaustion had blinded her steps. The stranger she encountered had tried to silence her questions, then tried to leave her behind. But she refused to give up. Kachada's understanding deepened. This woman, though frightened and worn, carried the strength of someone who refused to abandon the innocent. She had crossed into harsh lands without guidance, without protection, driven by loyalty stronger than fear. And now fate had placed her path directly across his. He could not ignore that. He would not ignore it. He asked for her name, and after a moment she shared it in a quiet voice that held both pride and sorrow. It fit her spirit well, strong, yet gentle, shaped by endurance. Kachada spoke it back to her with respect, grounding her presence in the moment. She met his gaze for the first time without fear, and in that brief connection he saw a spark of trust forming, before he could ask more. A sudden gust of wind stirred the brush behind them. The woman's breathing hitched. The warrior turned sharply toward the source of the sound, every sense alert. The canyon walls twisted into a narrow cut, dark and winding. The stranger had run that way. The danger followed him. And now, that same danger was circling closer to them. Kachada stepped forward and studied the ground. Fresh prints. Heavy boots. Several sets. The men who traveled with the stranger were near. Too near. His jaw tightened, and he motioned for the woman to stay close. She nodded, swallowing her fear. But her eyes kept drifting toward the shadowed path, as if memories of what lay beyond threatened to drag her backward. He asked her how many men were in the group. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to gather her thoughts. She whispered that there were at least 4 besides the stranger. Hard men, armed, cunning, and not afraid to hurt those who stood in their way. She told him they had spoken of using the children as bargaining pieces, though she did not understand what they wanted in return. She only knew time was slipping away. Kachada's grip on his strap tightened. This was no longer a simple search. It had become something sharper, darker, more tangled. And the stakes were far greater than he had known. He led the woman away from the exposed riverbank and into the partial cover of a rock ledge. She followed him carefully, her steps unsteady but determined. The canyon stretched ahead like a twisting tunnel of secrets. Somewhere within those shadows, the missing child waited. Somewhere within them, the girl the woman sought was held. And somewhere ahead, the band of desperate men plotted their next move. Kachada knew he needed to act fast, but he also knew rushing blindly would put them both in greater danger. He had to understand the hidden threads connecting all of this. He had to learn what the men were truly after, and he had to learn why. The woman's fear ran so deep when she spoke of the name she whispered earlier, a name that still lingered in his thoughts, like a warning. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound through the canyon. It's not footsteps, not voices. Something softer, a cry carried from far ahead, almost swallowed by the rocks. The woman's eyes widened, her breath catching. Kachada lifted his head, listening, trying to trace its source. The cry came again, faint but clearer. A child's cry. But before either of them could move toward it, another sound echoed behind them, the heavy rhythm of multiple footsteps approaching fast. The footsteps came fast, kicking up dust in sharp bursts. And Kachada instantly pulled the young woman deeper into the shelter of the rock ledge. She pressed her back against the stone, trying to quiet her breathing while the warrior crouched. At the edge, watching the shadows shift along the canyon floor, the sound grew louder, multiplied, echoing from different angles. It meant the men had split into smaller groups, moving like wolves on a hunt. They had not come all this way for nothing. They were after the woman or the children, or something tied to both. Whatever their reason, they were dangerous. And they were close enough now that even the wind seemed to draw a sharp breath. Kachada signaled for the woman to stay low. She nodded but clutched the fabric of her skirt as if grounding herself. Her eyes kept drifting to the narrow path where the stranger had run, fear flickering each time a pebble rolled or a bird stirred. She whispered that these men did not chase unless they meant to finish what they started. The weight in her voice told Kachada more than her words did. The danger was not new to her. She had seen the kind of trouble these men carried long before he found her by the river. That made everything heavier. She was not running from chance. She was running because she knew exactly what they were capable of. As the footsteps drew nearer, Kachada positioned himself where he could see the open stretch while still shielding her. The brush rustled, and 2 figures appeared, moving carefully, scanning the rocks as if expecting the warrior to strike from above. These men were not the stranger from before. They looked tougher, older, their faces shaded by dust and worry. One carried a rope at his belt, the other a rifle slung over his shoulder. They whispered sharply to each other, arguing in tense, low voices. Kachada picked out fragments. One of them mentioned the children. Another insisted they needed to find the woman before their leader returned. Their leader, word that struck Kachada with new curiosity, was the stranger he chased running from. This leader as well? Or was the stranger part of the plot but weakened by guilt? The woman said there were several men, but she never spoke of the one who controlled them. Whoever he was, his presence hung over the group like a shadow too heavy to ignore. The 2 men searched the rocks, unaware of how close their target hid. The woman trembled at each step they took. Her fear made Kachada want answers he had not yet demanded. When the men finally moved off toward the eastern ridge, the canyon grew quiet again, heavy with tension. Kachada turned back to her. She looked like she wanted to speak but feared her own words. He told her calmly that he needed the full truth now, everything she had tried to hide. She hesitated, twisting her fingers together, then finally lifted her gaze to him. Her voice came soft at first, but grew steadier as she forced herself to share what weighed on her. She told him her journey had begun weeks earlier, far beyond the ranch lands, in a settlement where she worked as a caretaker. The girl she protected had come from a family torn apart by hardship. The young woman had promised the child's mother she would keep the little one safe, no matter what storms rolled through their lives. But one night a group of men arrived, forcing their way into the settlement, searching for something the child carried, something the mother had hidden. The woman did not know what it was, only that the mother begged her to take the girl and flee before dawn. She did as she was told, traveling by night, hiding by day, until she crossed paths with the band of men hunting them, and then came the part they had been holding back. Those men were not wandering thieves or desperate ranch hands. They were part of a small but ruthless group that had been searching the frontier for months. Rumors said they were after a map or a token or some key tied to an old trade route. She didn't know the truth behind it, but she knew the girl had something connected to it. Something valuable enough that the men were willing to grab children and threaten entire settlements to find it. She believed they had taken both the lost child Kachada searched for, and the girl she had sworn to protect. Kachada absorbed her words, feeling each piece of the puzzle settle in his mind. So the children were connected by more than chance. They had become part of a chase rooted in greed and secrecy. And somewhere among those men was a leader who guided their steps. A man feared even by his own followers. He asked the woman if she had seen this leader. She nodded, her face paling. She described him not by name, but by the presence he carried. Quiet, watchful, calm, in a way that made her feel unsafe without him lifting a hand. A man who never raised his voice, but who everyone obeyed without question. She said she only saw him once from a distance, but the memory clung to her like cold mist. The stranger who fled earlier was one of his men, a lesser one. The leader was far worse. Kachada felt a chill pass under his skin. Men like that were dangerous not because they shouted, but because they acted without hesitation. They could blend into crowds, slip into towns, and leave chaos behind without ever showing their own face. If such a man had taken the children, the danger was deeper than Kachada first believed. As they moved farther along the canyon, following the faint cry he heard earlier, Kachada kept watchful eyes on the ridges. The woman stayed close behind him, careful not to slow her steps. He sensed her exhaustion, but also her resolve. She would not stop, and she would not collapse. Even if fear pressed against her like a tightening rope, the canyon widened slightly, revealing a narrow pass leading toward the southern hills. Kachada crouched to examine the ground. Fresh tracks. Small footprints, one set lighter, the other more hurried. The children had passed through here, and not long ago. But mixed with their tracks were heavier boot prints, deeper, more purposeful. The men were guiding them, not dragging them, as if they needed the children unharmed. That made Kachada uneasy. It meant the children had value beyond what he understood. He motioned for the woman to kneel beside him. She did, brushing her hand over one of the small footprints. Her voice cracked when she recognized the girl's step. She whispered that the girl had been tired, hungry, frightened, but still walking. The ache in her voice burned Kachada's chest. It reminded him why he had sworn to protect those who could not protect themselves. He told her that the children were alive. He could feel it. She nodded, blinking away tears she refused to let fall as they followed the trail. Kachada's mind worked through the pieces. The men had taken something they believed the children carried, or something connected to them. But what a map? A symbol? A message? The woman said she had not seen the object herself, only heard the mother speak of it in a desperate whisper before sending her away. He asked her if the mother had said anything specific, a phrase, a warning, clue. She searched her memory, clasping her hands as she walked. Finally, she whispered that the mother had said, "They will come for what is hidden, not for what is seen." The word sent a ripple through Kachada's thoughts. Hidden could mean anything. A carved mark, a memory, a story. Something passed down quietly, never spoken aloud. But before he could press further, a low whistle echoed across the rocks. not from wind. From a person signaling another. Kachada halted, pulling the woman behind a formation of boulders. Another whistle responded, this one closer. Then voices carried across the canyon floor. The men had regrouped. Kachada peered around the stone and saw 3 figures approaching, including the stranger from earlier. His steps were slower now, his face strained, as if he had realized running would not save him. The 2 men behind him spoke in hushed tones, one of them clearly angry. The stranger pointed to the southern path, explaining something with frantic gestures. The others cursed under their breath. Then one of the men said something that made the woman beside Kachada stiffen. He said their leader was coming. Kachada felt the air shift around them. The threat had grown larger. The walls seemed to close in. The woman's breathing turned shallow. She whispered that if the leader reached the children first, both of them would vanish into the frontier with no one to chase them. Before Kachada could decide their next move, the soft cry of a child echoed again, this time closer, this time followed by the snap of a branch. The branch snapped with a sharp crack that bounced off the canyon walls, and every muscle in Kachada's body tightened at once. He raised a hand to keep the young woman still, though she was already frozen in place. Her breath caught high in her chest. The sound had come from the cluster of brush on the lower slope, not far from where the men stood arguing. One of the men spun toward the noise, his hand dropping to the handle of his rifle, while the stranger backed away with fear tightening his face. Kachada watched their reactions closely. None of them looked relieved. None of them acted like men who had found what they were searching for. Instead, they moved like people who felt something slipping out of their grasp. A soft cry followed the snap of the branch, brief but unmistakable. A child's voice. The woman clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from calling out. Her eyes flooded with hope and fear tangled together. Kachada steadied her shoulder gently, reminding her with one look that rushing forward would bring danger faster than safety. She nodded, though, her entire being pulled toward that sound. He knew she wanted to run to the children, to hold them, to protect them from the terror that stalked the canyon. But if the men reached the children first, everything would fall apart. The group of 3 hurried toward the sound, their boots crunching through brush. The stranger lingered behind the other 2, his expression twisted with something close to regret. He looked toward the slope where the cry had come from, then toward the path he had fled through earlier, as if torn between 2 doomed choices. The larger man barked at him to move. The stranger obeyed reluctantly, his body tense like someone stepping into a trap he could not avoid. Kachada guided the woman backward into the deeper shadow of the rock formation. He spoke low and calm, telling her they needed to take a higher ridge to circle around the men. He knew the land offered narrow climbs invisible to travelers and raiders. It was a path rarely used, but he trusted his memory of every ledge he had crossed in boyhood. If they could reach the ridge above the slope, they might see the children first. They might get a chance to act before the men tightened their circle. The woman agreed without hesitation. Fear might have chased her for days, but courage drove her now. They climbed the ledge carefully, staying low, using the stone for cover. The air warmed as the sun rose higher, filling the canyon with that old American brightness that made every shadow sharper, every footstep louder. Kachada moved swiftly but cautiously, always scanning the ground for loose rocks that might roll and give them away. As they reached the top of the ridge, the view opened below them. The brush rustled on the slope where the cry had come from. A small movement caught Kachada's eye. Something shifted behind a large cluster of thorn bushes. Then a small figure crouched low, trembling. The child. Tiny, scared, dust-covered. A pair of wide eyes watched the men approaching. Trying to stay hidden, the woman's breath broke, a trembling sound she couldn't contain. Kachada placed a steadying hand on her back. But before they could move, another small shape shifted behind the first. The girl the woman had been searching for was there too, clutching the younger child, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. She was trying to keep the smaller one quiet, even though fear shook her thin arms. Kachada felt the weight of the moment twist inside him. The children were alive, huddled only yards away from the very danger they fled. The men were closing in, unaware of how near their quarry hid. The stranger's steps dragged, as if he dreaded what he might find. Then the larger man cursed loudly and spread his arms, ordering the others to split up. One climbed the left side of the slope. The other moved toward the right. The stranger stood in the middle, staring at the bushes where the children hid. His eyes softened, and his shoulders slumped slightly. For a moment, Kachata thought he might turn away. But then the large man shouted his name harshly, and the moment shattered. Kachata whispered for the woman to stay hidden. She nodded, though her whole body leaned toward the children. He slipped along the ridge, staying above the slope, preparing to take advantage of the high ground. His movements were silent, but his heart pounded with a steady, controlled rhythm. He watched every angle, every shadow, every path the men might take. The tension in the canyon twisted tighter, ready to snap. Below, the stranger stepped closer to the thorn bushes. The children saw him and shrank back, fear shaking their small bodies. He whispered something under his breath, something Kachata couldn't hear, but the children remained locked in terror. The larger man grew impatient and raised his rifle to push aside the brush. Before he reached it, a new sound split the air. Hoof, bast, fast, fast, thunder rolling across hard. Earth Kachata's eyes snapped to the western ridge. Dust rose in a long trail. One rider, moving like a storm forced into human form. Whoever it was, the men below recognized him instantly. Fear rippled through them. The large man lowered his rifle. The stranger went pale. The other man froze entirely. The leader was coming. The woman's hand tightened on the rock ledge in dread. She whispered that the leader never rode alone. If he was coming, others would be near. The children seemed to sense a new fear filling the canyon. The older girl tried to pull the younger child deeper into the brush, but their hiding place could not shield them much longer. Kachata watched the rider approach with growing tension. The horse tore down the slope with practiced power. The rider's face was shadowed beneath a wide hat, but his posture straightened as he slowed. He surveyed the scene with unnerving calm. No shouting, no anger. Only a cold focus that tightened the air like a drawn bowstring. The stranger stepped forward, stammering something. The leader didn't respond. Instead, he scanned the ridgetops. His gaze paused briefly, sending a jolt through Kachata, even though he remained hidden. The man's instincts were sharp. Too sharp, he dismounted, moved toward the thorn bushes, and studied the ground. Without looking up, he said something to his men in a low, controlled tone. His voice carried power that didn't need volume. The men obeyed instantly. The woman's breathing turned shaky. She whispered that if the leader took the children now, they would vanish into the frontier before sunset. No one would find them again, not even Kachata. Kachata knew she was right. They were running out of time. The enemy watched everything. The canyon was tightening like a trap. And somewhere below, the children trembled only steps from the hands trying to claim them. He leaned forward, preparing to strike from the ridge, but before he could act, something else shifted in the canyon. Another set of hoofbeats in the distance, not from the leader's men. From the opposite direction, soft at first, then clearer. A second rider, approaching from the northern flats, unscheduled, unexpected. The leader turned sharply. Scanning the direction of the approaching sound, Kachata felt the land itself pause. Whoever was coming did not belong to the leader's group. That alone twisted the tension deeper. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The stranger looked ready to collapse from nerves. The children sensed the rising danger and whimpered. Softly, the woman clutched the rock so tightly her knuckles turned white. Kachata knew they were moments, away from chaos breaking loose. If the leader reached the children before the second rider arrived, the fight would become impossible. If the second rider turned out to be another threat, everything would collapse at once. As the second rider neared, dust rising behind him, the leader straightened, eyes narrowing, hand drifting toward his holstered weapon. Kachata readied himself to strike. Feeling every part of the moment balance on a razor's edge, the children huddled together. Exposed, the woman's heart pounded with fear for The leader drew a slow breath, and the shadow of the second rider finally reached the canyon floor. Everything was about to collide. The second rider galloped into the canyon, with the sun flaring behind him, turning his figure into a dark silhouette racing across the dust. For a breath, no one moved. Even the leader's men froze, unsure whether this new arrival was friend, foe, or something worse. The children crouched lower in the thorn bushes, fear pressing them into the earth. The woman beside Kachada tightened her grip on the rocks, her heart pounding so hard the warrior could feel its tremor through the air. As the rider slowed, his outline sharpened. He was young, strong, and carried himself with the steady confidence of someone who had been searching for days without giving up. Kachada recognized him. His name was Tokoda, a scout known in quiet stories told across the frontier. He had helped ranchers, settlers, and wanderers, without ever asking for anything in return. The warrior had crossed paths with him once in the past. A man of honor. A man who valued truth over profit. And more importantly, a man who never rode into danger without knowing exactly why he came. The leader narrowed his eyes at the newcomer. But Tokoda didn't flinch. He rode straight toward the slope, dismounted, and gave a firm nod to the men standing tense with their weapons half raised. His gaze then drifted to the thorn bushes where the children hid, and for a brief moment, relief softened his expression. He knew why he had been tracking across the plains. He knew exactly who he had come for. When he turned to the leader, his voice carried a calm warning. He said he had followed the men's trail from the settlement and that he knew what they had taken. He said the children were under his protection now. The leader's lips curved into a faint, cold smirk, and he answered with a sharp refusal. The men behind him tightened their hands around their weapons, waiting for orders. The stranger among them shifted nervously, as if the ground were turning to sand beneath him. Kachada knew the moment was close. The canyon held its breath. Everything that had been building was now pressing toward one point, and if the wrong move was made, the children would be caught in the storm. He placed a steady hand on the woman's shoulder, gave her a silent signal, then moved along the ridge until he stood at a point directly above the slope. Below, the leader stepped closer to where the children hid. His expression was calm, as if he held full confidence that no one would dare stop him. He reached a hand toward the brush. That was when Kachada made his move. He launched himself from the ridge with the precision of a hawk striking prey. His boots hit the ground between the leader and the children with a solid thud. Dust burst upward. The leader stepped back in surprise for the first time since he arrived. The canyon erupted with gasps from every direction. Tokoda reached for his weapon, ready to defend. The woman scrambled down the slope, her voice breaking as she called to the children. The men raised their rifles, but hesitated, unsure whether to fire or flee. The stranger stared at Kachada with something close to gratitude flickering through his troubled eyes. Kachada stood tall, blocking the leader's path. His face was set, his stance unwavering, his presence a barrier of pure will. The leader studied him with calculating calm, measuring the warrior's determination in a low, steady voice. Kachada told him the children were going home. The leader tilted his head slightly, then signaled for his men to lower their weapons. The canyon shifted with confusion as they obeyed. He stepped closer, locking eyes with Kachada. He asked why the warrior would risk so much for children who were not his own. Kachada answered simply that no child should pay the price for grown men's greed. That truth echoed through the canyon with more weight than any shout. The leader held his stare for a long moment. Then something in his expression cracked. Not anger, but something darker. He said the children carried something important, something hidden from the settlers, something that belonged to older paths of trade and land. But when Kachada refused to step aside, the leader's voice hardened. He ordered his men to seize the children. Before they could move, Tokoda intervened. He drew his weapon with a fluid motion and warned the men that they had already crossed too many lines. The stranger among them let out a shout, telling them all to stop. His voice shook, but his words came clear. He confessed everything. The map they sought wasn't a map at all, but a carved stone the girl carried in a small pouch given by her mother. A stone that pointed toward old water routes forgotten by the settlers. The men believed the stone would lead them to wealth, but all it held were stories, traditions, and knowledge meant to survive, not be stolen. The stranger said he had not wanted things to turn violent. He had wanted to leave the group, but fear kept him tied to them. He said he never harmed the children, but he could no longer stand by. He begged the leader to let them go. Silence followed. Then the leader, seeing his own men shaken and outnumbered by courage rather than guns, finally exhaled a long breath. He turned to his men, lowered his hand, and told them they were finished here. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode out of the canyon. The others followed reluctantly, but none dared disobey. When they were gone, the canyon breathed again. The children rushed from the bushes, stumbling into the arms of the woman, who broke into soft sobs as she held them. The girl clung to her tightly, whispering her name over and over. The younger child hid his face against her shoulder, trembling with relief. Kachada knelt beside them, speaking softly, grounding them back into safety. Dakota approached and offered supplies, wrapping them in blankets he had carried on his saddle. The stranger lingered in shame, unsure whether he deserved forgiveness. Kachada looked at him for a long moment, then told him quietly that redemption came from choices, not excuses. If he truly wished to change, he should leave these lands and start over where no one knew his past. The stranger nodded, tears gathering in his eyes, and walked away slowly, disappearing into the open plains. As the sun lowered, turning the canyon golden again, Kachada guided the children and the woman along the safer path toward the open terrain. The journey back felt lighter than the one that had brought them here. The weight of fear had lifted. The promise of peace shone ahead. When they reached the ridge overlooking the settlement valley, the woman turned to Kachada. Her eyes held gratitude deeper than words. She thanked him not only for saving the children, but for saving her from the darkness that had chased her for days. She said she would never forget the strength she saw in him, or the way he stood like a shield against the dangers that hunted them. Dakota clapped Kachada's shoulder with a familiar grin before riding off, promising to watch the frontier roads for any sign of the leader returning. The warrior nodded, knowing their paths would cross again someday. As the settlement lights flickered below, the children ran ahead with relief, brightening their steps. The woman lingered beside Kachada for one last moment. She told him that the frontier was a wild place, but people like him kept hope alive. He simply bowed his head in quiet respect, a gesture carrying more meaning than any grand speech. Then she took the children's hands and led them home. Kachada watched them go until they disappeared into the warm embrace of the settlement. The night breeze brushed against his skin, carrying the steady heartbeat of the land he loved. The danger had passed, the children were safe, and the frontier was quiet once again. With the stars rising above him, he turned toward the open plains, ready for whatever new path awaited him. For a tireless Apache warrior, there was always another dawn.